When managing a project, there are various factors that affect the project in general and also how it's managed. It's important to consider these factors, which will aid you in your planning efforts and also in communicating correctly with your project resources, teams, and vendors. Some of these factors may also include educating your project team on a communication level. But in order to do this, you need to be educated yourself. In this movie, we will touch on 3 primary factors. They are cultural and social environment, international and political environment, and the physical environment. Let's start off by going into more detail on the first one, cultural and social environment. This is becoming more and more important as project teams are now commonly spread out globally. There are different layers to the cultural aspect. It can mean company culture or ethnic culture, even religious and economic cultures come into play. The bottom line is that if you are dealing with a new organization or dealing within a new area, it is important to understand your customer and team in order to communicate and work effectively. Not doing so can cause the downfall of your project. Let me give you a real-life example. I worked directly with a team abroad and experienced a learning curve in the beginning when communicating project requirements and receiving updates. Our team abroad didn't think it was acceptable to request for additional resources or information. To admit to not understanding the requirements was the same as admitting failure to that group. But this caused gaps in what they were doing and what was requested of them, as you can imagine. Once the issue was picked up on, it required education and training on both ends. This is one example of understanding the cultural environment. Our team abroad also had an intense work ethic, and you had to be mindful of that as well to make sure that they were not overworked, which would affect the quality of work and retention and of course their health. A company culture is just as important, and this not only includes understanding your own organization's culture, but also that of your external stakeholders and your vendors. Some companies are more formal than others, and there is a different chain of command that you need to be aware of. When we look at organizational structures, we discuss the different levels of authority that a project manager has, but I mention this now because it also is important to know what this level of authority is within a company that you are dealing with, and also how the role of project management is perceived. This can explain a lot when you feel like you're not getting anywhere within your efforts, for example, in trying to acquire resources or in expressing concerns for project changes. What you do in these cases is figure out how to get around these obstacles by understanding how the company does operate. It's also important to understand how the project may affect others and also how others may affect the project. You do this by understanding everything that we just discussed in this movie so far. This forethought and planning can be what allows you to successfully manage your project. Our second point, international and political environment, will come into play in similar scenarios than what we discussed in the first, where you are dealing with global teams or projects, and it will vary per project. You'll most likely know immediately whether this is relevant to your project. Here are some things to keep in mind when applicable: national, international, regional, and local laws, customs, whether the political climate can affect your project, and this is something that really needs to be considered in offshore projects where you may not be familiar with how the system works or what is happening on a political level. There's also time zones and holidays. Holidays is actually a big one to know up front. This can affect your resource scheduling and impact your project schedule if you aren't aware of the holidays affecting your offshore teams. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is vacation time that your project team and resources have scheduled. The project schedule should all account for these things. For virtual teams, you also need to consider whether in-person meetings need to occur. If so, travel must be considered, as well as technology that may allow you to have that FaceTime, such as video conferencing. What is meant by our third point, physical environment, is literally how the physical environment is affected by our project. For example, taking into consideration the local ecology, the physical geography, understanding whether there are restrictions, such as protected areas. I once knew a colleague who purchased 6 acres of property to use for business purposes, and it turned out that a great deal of the property was protected, meaning he could not alter the wildlife on it in any way. There may have been more to consider here than you initially had expected. Managing projects requires a large amount of planning, forethought, and awareness. You consider the project on multiple levels, which allows you to properly manage risks and avoid issues that could have easily been prevented. And that wraps up our 5th area of expertise for effective project management.